The storm had swept through the small town of Millwood with ferocity, a flash flood that no one could have prepared for. The rain had come down in torrents, drenching everything in its path, flooding homes, roads, and businesses in mere hours. People rushed to higher ground, carrying their belongings with them. But among the chaos, there were those who were left behind. Animals, abandoned, trapped in places where no one would think to look. Jake Bennett stood in the pouring rain, his weathered face etched with concern as he and his 10-year-old son, Eli, made their way through the thickening water to check on Jake's tool shed. It had been hours since the storm started, and the floodwaters had risen higher than expected. The creek by their property, normally a slow-moving trickle, had swollen into a dangerous river, spilling over its banks and creeping toward the old wooden structure. Eli, his small hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jacket, looked up at his father, the concern in his eyes matching his father's. The storm had rattled him more than usual. His mother had passed away the year before, and every storm, every gust of wind, felt like another piece of his world crumbling away. "I think we should go back, Dad," Eli said quietly, his voice trembling as he glanced around nervously. Jake placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll check the shed and then head back. The water's rising fast, but we'll be fine." But as they neared the shed, something caught Jake's attention. A faint sound, a soft, desperate bark, carried through the wind, barely audible over the rush of the floodwaters. Jake stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. "Did you hear that, Eli?" he asked, his voice tight. Eli nodded, his eyes wide. "What was that?" Jake squinted through the rain, scanning the area. The barking continued, growing a little louder, though still muffled by the storm. Without a word, Jake motioned for Eli to follow him as he moved toward the sound. The two of them waded through the murky flood water, their boots sinking into the soft ground beneath them. Behind the shed, in the corner of the yard, they found the source of the sound, a large, rusted cage half submerged in water. Inside, a German shepherd lay motionless, her fur matted with mud and water, her eyes barely open as she struggled to breathe. The water was rising quickly, creeping higher and higher, and the dog's body was beginning to shiver uncontrollably. Jake's heart sank. The dog looked like she had been there for hours, possibly even longer, trapped in the cage with no way to escape. Her coat, once likely a rich golden brown, was now soaked and stained with dirt, and her body was thin, emaciated from lack of food and care. She barely moved, her eyes meeting Jake's with a quiet desperation. "Dad, is she going to be okay?" Eli asked, his voice cracking as he stepped closer to the cage. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the lock, but the rusted metal refused to budge. The sound of the rising floodwater and the dog's faint, broken whimpering echoed in his ears, spurring him into action. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed a nearby piece of metal and forced it against the lock, breaking it open. The dog let out a low whimper, a sound that tugged at his heart. Jake quickly reached in and, with great care, pulled the dog free. She barely had the strength to stand as he lifted her into his arms. "Come on, girl," Jake muttered, the words barely audible over the rain. "We've got you." Eli moved to help, his small hands gently reaching out to hold the dog's head as Jake cradled her in his arms. They hurried toward the house, the dog limp in their hands, her body too weak to protest, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Jake felt the weight of the world pressing down on him as he looked down at the animal in his arms. The storm had taken so much from them already, and now, in this moment of chaos, they had found something to hold on to, something that needed them just as much as they needed her. As they reached the door of the house, Eli looked up at his father. "What are we going to name her, Dad?" Jake paused, glancing down at the dog's battered face. "I don't know yet," he said quietly, "but she's going to be okay. We'll take care of her." Inside the warmth of their small house, Jake wrapped the dog in his jacket, placing her gently on the couch. She trembled, her eyes darting around the room, as if unsure of what to do next. Eli knelt beside her, his small hand gently stroking her damp fur. The dog's tail gave a tiny, almost a imperceptible wag. "She's scared," Eli said softly, his voice full of empathy. Jake nodded, his mind already racing with what they needed to do next. "We'll take her to the vet tomorrow, get her checked out. For now, let's just get her warm and safe." As the night dragged on, the storm outside continued to rage. But inside the Bennett home, there was a quiet sense of hope. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there, just as the dog's quiet presence was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, something could still survive. Something could still be saved. The floodwaters had reached their peak by nightfall, but the rain still showed no signs of stopping. Jake and Eli sat in the living room, the storm's roar echoing outside, its intensity leaving the house shaking under each gust of wind. Jake's hands were still wet, his coat damp from the brief journey out into the storm. He sat by the fire, warming his hands while Eli knelt beside the couch, his eyes fixed on the German shepherd, who was curled up in a trembling heap beneath the blanket. River, Jake had decided on the name after Eli's gentle suggestion, lay still, her body curled up in the warmth, though her eyes still flicked around nervously. Her breathing was shallow, her ribs visible beneath her mud-caked fur. It was clear that she'd been through hell. And yet, she hadn't fought them, hadn't barked or growled, just silently endured. Jake felt a pang in his chest as he looked down at her. He knew that the road to recovery would be long. He had seen enough hardships in his years as a carpenter to know that. But he wasn't prepared for what he would learn the next day. The morning sun brought little relief. The storm had finally slowed to a drizzle. But the floodwaters remained high, leaving the streets of Millwood submerged. Jake and Eli didn't venture out until the afternoon when the rain had finally stopped. They took River to the vet, a small, run-down clinic just a few miles from their home. The town's veterinary services were minimal, but they had nowhere else to go. The vet, Dr. Haley, was a no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s, with short dark hair and a kind but weary smile. She took one look at River and immediately began assessing the situation. "She's in rough shape," Dr. Haley murmured as she examined the dog's limbs, her hands gentle but firm. Her body's covered in old scars. I'd say she's been through more than a few rough patches in her life. Jake nodded, his jaw tightening as he looked at River's broken, thin body. He knew she hadn't been well cared for. He could tell by the way she held herself. Always wary, always on edge. Dr. Haley checked River's legs and paws, her fingers tracing the signs of an old, untreated fracture. The dog flinched slightly when Dr. Haley touched the injured leg, but she didn't growl. She didn't fight back. She simply endured the touch, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and submission. "An old fracture," Dr. Haley explained, "likely from being hit or kicked. It's healing now, but it was never treated. She's been living with this pain for who knows how long, and it doesn't look like she's had proper food or care in a while." Jake's stomach tightened. He could see the devastation in River's eyes, a silent suffering that spoke louder than any words could. This dog had lived through things no one should ever endure, and yet, here she was, still breathing, still holding on. But despite the trauma, River was quiet, never once showing aggression. She sat still on the examination table, her eyes following the vet's every move, her body tense but passive. It was as if she had learned not to fight, not to hope for anything. Jake wondered if she had ever known kindness before. "She's strong," Dr. Haley continued, "but she's also scared. The trauma she's been through, it's going to take some time to heal, mentally and physically. I'll give her some antibiotics and pain meds, but I'd recommend a quiet place for her to recover, somewhere she can feel safe." Jake looked at Eli, who stood beside the table, his face filled with concern. He reached out, patting River's head gently. The dog didn't flinch this time. Her eyes softened just a little, as if she was beginning to trust them. "That's exactly what she needs," Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "A quiet place. Safe. Away from all of this." And as they left the clinic, Jake felt a surge of protectiveness for the dog. He had known hardship in his own life, but seeing River's suffering, her silent endurance, touched him in a way he hadn't expected. He glanced down at Eli, who was walking beside him, his hand resting gently on River's back as they headed back home. "What do you think of her, Eli?" Jake asked as they approached their truck. Eli didn't answer immediately. He was deep in thought, his eyes fixed on the dog. Finally, he looked up at his father, his voice small but full of sincerity. "She's just like us, Dad. She's been through a lot. But she's still here. She's still trying." Jake nodded. His heart swelled at his son's words. In the years since his wife's death, Eli had become quieter, more reserved, his grief hidden behind a wall of silence. But in that moment, Jake saw something shift. Maybe it was the bond they were beginning to form with River. Maybe it was just the simple act of caring for something else, of protecting it, that was starting to heal them both. When they got home, they settled River into the spare room, a small space that had once been a guest bedroom. Jake took the time to clean her wounds, gently tending to her as Eli watched from the doorway. River was still hesitant, still unsure of them, but there was a quiet trust in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Eli asked quietly. Jake smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "She's going to be okay, Eli. She's with us now." As the days passed, River's condition slowly improved. She began to eat a little more, her appetite returning in small bursts. Her tail, once tucked between her legs in fear, began to wag slightly when Eli approached her. She would watch him closely as he spoke to her in the soft, soothing voice he reserved for her alone. But as they settled into this new routine, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to River's past than he had initially realized. The dog's fear was deep-rooted, her eyes haunted by something he couldn't fully understand. And then, one day, the truth began to show itself in ways he couldn't ignore. River's recovery was slow, but there was progress. Each day, Jake and Eli worked to make her feel at home. The house, once heavy with grief, began to feel a little lighter. The soft sound of River's paws on the wooden floors and the gentle rustling of her fur as she adjusted to her new life were small reminders of hope. But despite the comfort and safety of her new surroundings, River remained a shadow of herself. The dog was always alert, her body tense, her eyes constantly darting around the room. She was clearly exhausted, yet sleep seemed to elude her. There were moments when she would close her eyes. Her body slumped in a temporary moment of rest. But the faintest sound, the creak of a door, the sound of Eli's footstep, would rouse her immediately. It was as if the peace she had been given was too fragile, too foreign. Jake watched her closely. He had seen the signs of trauma in animals before, particularly in rescue cases. But something about River felt different. She was quiet, almost unnervingly so. There was no aggressive behavior, no growling or snapping, just a deep, unspoken sadness. The vet, Dr. Haley, had warned Jake that River's emotional scars could take as long to heal as her physical ones. "She's been through something terrible," Dr. Haley had said, "but she's not broken. She just needs time." Jake tried to be patient, but there were moments when the silence in the house felt unbearable. Eli had been especially quiet since they brought River home, often sitting next to the dog and talking to her about his mother. Jake could tell that his son was trying to connect with the dog in a way that went beyond just caring for her physical wounds. He saw the way Eli would sit for hours, gently stroking River's fur, talking to her about the mother he missed so much. "She never got to see the things I can do," Eli had said one evening as he sat next to the dog, his voice wistful. But I think maybe she can hear me now. She never leaves, not like Mom." Jake had nodded, but it was hard for him to reply. The loss of his wife still sat heavy in his chest, a pain that no amount of time seemed to lessen. The grief had changed him, and it had changed Eli too. But seeing Eli open up to River, forming a bond with her, gave Jake a sense of hope he hadn't realized he needed. The first time River wagged her tail was a moment Jake would never forget. It was subtle. A faint twitch of her tail as Eli approached her with a bowl of food. It had been a week since they found her, and though she had eaten small amounts each day, her appetite was still weak. The tail wag wasn't much, just a brief flick of movement, but for Jake and Eli, it was a sign. A small victory in the war against the darkness that had clouded their lives for so long. Eli smiled softly at the sight of River responding to him. "Look, Dad, she's getting better," he exclaimed, his voice full of hope. Jake couldn't help but smile, though it was tinged with sadness. There was so much more to River's recovery than just food and shelter. Her spirit had been broken in ways they couldn't yet understand. That afternoon, Jake decided it was time to take River to the park. The weather had cleared up, and though the floodwaters had not fully receded, the rain had stopped and the air felt fresher. He thought it might be good for River to get out of the house, to see the world beyond the walls of their small home. It wasn't much, but he hoped it might help her feel freer, less confined by the trauma she carried. Jake clipped on River's leash, and though she hesitated at first, she followed him out the door. Eli trotted beside them, his excitement contagious. The park was a short walk from their house, and as they approached, River's steps became more hesitant, her eyes scanning the open space warily. Jake could see the anxiety building within her as she took in the new environment. The wide open space, the sounds of children playing, and the distant barking of other dogs. All of it seemed overwhelming to her. Eli crouched down beside River, whispering gently to her, "It's okay, girl. We're just going for a walk. It'll be all right." Jake's heart ached as he watched the interaction between his son and the dog. Eli's voice was soft and soothing, but River remained still, her body tense, her head slightly lowered, as if she were bracing for something. She wasn't ready to trust the world again. They walked slowly, River's paws tentative against the ground, her eyes constantly scanning. As they made their way along the path, River suddenly stopped. Her ears perked at the sound of something in the distance. A car engine, the sound of a child's laughter, or maybe even the wind rustling the leaves. Whatever it was enough to send her into a state of panic. River suddenly bolted, yanking on the leash and nearly knocking Jake off balance. She ran as fast as she could, her body low to the ground, her muscles taut with fear. Jake cursed under his breath, his heart racing as he struggled to regain control of the leash. Eli stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock. "River!" Jake shouted, trying to catch up to her, but the dog was already too far ahead, running down the path, her body trembling with panic. Jake's mind raced as he fought to hold on. What had triggered this? Was she remembering something from her past, something that had made her run like this? Or was she simply overwhelmed by the new environment, too much of the world rushing at her too soon? "Come back, River," Eli cried, his voice breaking. "Please!" It took Jake a few moments, but he managed to catch up with River, finally pulling her back to him with gentle but firm hands. She was panting heavily, her eyes wide with fear, her body trembling. As Jake knelt down to her level, he saw the deep fear in her eyes, something primal, something she couldn't shake. Jake didn't say anything as he pulled her close, his arms around her, holding her in place. Eli knelt beside them, rubbing River's head gently. "She's scared, Dad," Eli said quietly, his voice full of understanding. "I think she's been through a lot. Maybe we need to take it slower." Jake nodded, his heart heavy. "Yeah, we will. We'll go at her pace." Days turned into weeks, and River's recovery was slow but steady. The world outside their home continued on, life moving forward with the rhythm of time, while inside the Bennett house, the dog, now named River, began to find small pockets of peace. Eli, despite his quiet nature, had become her closest companion. Where Jake's gruff exterior seemed to calm River, it It was Eli's soft words and patient touch that slowly began to coax the dog out of her shell. Every day, Eli spent hours beside her, whispering to her, gently encouraging her to eat or to walk around. It was as if he had known, in some way, that River needed him just as much as he needed her. "Mom used to tell me that dogs can listen when you talk to them," Eli said one evening as he sat on the floor, River curled up next to him, her head resting on his knee. "I don't know if you can understand me, but I think you can hear me." Jake paused from where he was standing in the doorway, watching his son and the dog. Eli's voice, low and full of quiet emotion, seemed to fill the room in a way that brought a sense of calm. Eli had always been quiet, withdrawn since his mother's passing. The loss had taken something from him, his laughter, his carefree spirit. But watching him speak to River, Jake realized that, for the first time in a long while, his son wasn't just speaking to fill the silence. He was speaking to heal. River lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting Eli's. There was no wagging of the tail, no jumping for joy, but Jake saw something in the dog's eyes that he hadn't seen before, something that resembled understanding. Eli smiled faintly, continuing his monologue to the dog. "I miss her, River. I miss the way she used to tell me stories before bed, how she'd sing to me when I was scared. But now, it's just me and Dad. And now it's you too." Oh, the room fell silent, the weight of Eli's words hanging in the air. Jake felt his chest tighten, his eyes momentarily betraying him as he blinked back the sudden rush of emotion. He hadn't known what to say to Eli about his mother's death, hadn't known how to bridge the gap that had opened between them. But now, as Eli shared this with River, who listened quietly, without judgment or interruption, Jake began to see something new. The way his son was opening up, even if only to a dog. Eli was healing in his own quiet way, just as River was. And maybe, just maybe, they were both helping each other in ways that were too complex to put into words. It wasn't just Eli who had begun to change. River, too, was showing small signs of growth, of trust. Each day, she grew a little more comfortable in the house. And though her wary eyes never fully left her surroundings, there was a growing familiarity in the way she looked at her new family. Her tail, once completely still, now wagged gently when Eli entered the room, and the sound of it against the floor was a small victory in itself. It was as if, slowly, she was learning to let go of the fear that had gripped her for so long. One afternoon, Jake watched as Eli sat outside with River, the two of them sitting in the small patch of sunlight that had broken through the clouds. River lay with her head on Eli's lap, eyes half closed, enjoying the warmth. Eli's fingers gently stroked the dog's fur as he spoke to her, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet of the afternoon. "I used to wonder why Mom had to go," Eli said quietly, his words barely above a whisper. It didn't make sense. I still don't know if I'll ever understand. But I think she would have liked you, River. She always loved animals. Maybe she sent you to me. Maybe you're here to help me with all this stuff." Jake's heart skipped a beat as he stood there, watching the exchange. It was as if Eli had opened a door that had been closed for so long, one that had been holding back the grief, the pain. He had always been so closed off, so guarded that Jake hadn't known how to reach him, but now it was as if the presence of this dog, this silent, broken creature, had created a bridge. River, in her own way, was healing Eli's broken heart just as much as she was mending her own. Jake stepped out onto the porch, the floor creaking beneath his boots. He moved quietly, careful not to disturb the moment between his son and the dog. He stood beside them for a while, watching as Eli continued to speak to River in the soft, soothing way he always did. His words were a mixture of memories, hopes, and grief, a stream of consciousness that flowed freely now, as if the walls he had built around his emotions were beginning to crumble. "Dad," Eli said suddenly, looking up at him, "do you think Do you think River is lonely? Yeah, I know she's been through a lot, but do you think she misses her old family? Jake's chest tightened at the question. He crouched down beside Eli and a white River, taking a deep breath before responding. I think she misses something, Eli, he said, his voice thick. Maybe she misses her old life. Or maybe she misses someone who loved her, but we're here now. We're her family. Eli nodded, a small, uncertain smile on his face. Yeah, I guess we are. The air felt thick with emotion, heavy with things unsaid. But in that moment, Jake understood something. River might have been broken in more ways than one. But so was Eli. And just like River, Eli needed time to heal. He needed love, patience, and someone who wouldn't give up on him. Jake had been that for his son in the past, doing his best to shield him from the pain of losing his mother. But now, it was River who had come into their lives to teach them both how to open up, to trust again. The connection between them all was deeper than anything Jake had expected. In the midst of their own pain and grief, they had found each other. River wasn't just a dog. She was a mirror to their own suffering, and in her silent companionship, she was helping them heal. Jake reached out and placed his hand gently on River's head, feeling the warmth of her fur beneath his fingers. She turned her head to look up at him, her eyes soft, trusting. It was the first time she had looked at him like that, without fear, without hesitation. It was the beginning of something new, something powerful. River, once so broken, was slowly becoming part of their family, a part that would stay, a part that would help them rebuild what they had lost. And Jake, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the broken could be mended together. As the days stretched into weeks, the house began to feel different. It wasn't the same as it had been before, and it was certainly nothing like the empty, hollow space it had been after Sarah passed away. The house now hummed with a quiet energy, a warmth that had been missing for so long. There was laughter again, soft, hesitant at first, but growing more comfortable with time. There was joy, too, though it was a kind of joy that had been built slowly, carefully, layer by layer, like the rebuilding of a broken bridge. River had come to mean more than just a dog to the Bennett family. She was a companion, a silent partner in the healing process. Every little sign of progress, every tail wag, every quiet moment of trust shared between her and Eli was a step towards something new, something better. Jake had come to look forward to these small victories, something as simple as River eating an extra meal or resting peacefully at Eli's feet instead of retreating into a corner. One evening, Jake came home from work to find the living room alive with energy. Eli was sitting on the floor, a stuffed toy in his hands, and River was sitting beside him, her head tilted in curiosity. Eli was talking to her, as he had been doing for weeks, but this time something had changed. River wasn't just watching him. She was participating. Her tail wagged, her ears perked up, and as Eli tossed the toy a few feet away, River stood, hesitant at first, then lunged forward and grabbed the toy in her mouth. "Did you see that, Dad?" Eli exclaimed, his face lighting up with joy. "She actually played! River's playing!" Jake stood in the doorway, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he watched the scene unfold. It was hard to believe how far they had come, how much River had transformed since that first day when she had been so frail and fearful, barely able to move. "That's a big step, Eli," Jake said, walking over and kneeling beside them. He reached out to scratch River behind the ears. "She's a good girl, isn't she?" River wagged her tail again, the first full wag Jake had seen in weeks. It was a small thing, but it was enough. It was a sign that River was no longer just surviving. She was living. And for the first time since they found her in the flood, Jake could see a spark of happiness in her eyes. Later that evening, as the sun set and the house settled into the quiet of the night, Jake sat at the kitchen table, looking at the family photo on the wall. It was a picture from before Sarah had passed away. Jake, Sarah, and Eli smiling at the camera, their faces full of hope. It seemed like another lifetime, another version of themselves. But Jake couldn't help but think that they had made it through something together. The grief that had weighed them down for so long had shifted just a little, and the presence of River had been the catalyst. Eli came into the kitchen with River by his side. He was carrying a small bowl of water for the dog, his eyes filled with the same light-hearted joy he had been showing all day. "Dad, look," Eli said, his voice full of excitement. "River's already learned to sit when I tell her. She's so smart." Jake looked over at the two of them. River, sitting obediently by Eli's feet, looked up at him with calm, trusting eyes. It was a moment of peace, something Jake hadn't realized he'd been craving until now. "She's getting there, Eli," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're doing great with her. You know, she's lucky to have you." Eli smiled, the weight of his usual sadness lifting for a moment. He walked over to Jake, holding out the bowl of water for River, and then sat down beside him. "I think she's lucky to have us too, Dad. I think she knows she's safe now." Jake looked at his son, the words catching in his throat. Eli was right. River had come into their lives at just the right time. She had been broken, just like they had, but now she was healing. And so were they. In her quiet way, River had become a lifeline, a reminder that, even in the darkest times, there was always a chance for something new, something beautiful. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, each one bringing a little more progress, a little more light into their home. River's health improved steadily. She gained weight, her coat began to shine again, and her muscles, once atrophied from lack of use, became strong and agile. And with each improvement, Jake saw something else. River was becoming a part of their family in ways that went beyond her physical recovery. She was learning to trust, and in turn they were learning to trust her. One Saturday afternoon, Jake took River for a walk. It had become their ritual, the two of them, alone, strolling along the quiet road near their house. It was a time for Jake to clear his mind, to think about everything they had been through, and to be grateful for how far they had come. River had grown so much in such a short time. She walked beside him now, her pace steady, her tail wagging occasionally as they moved down the road. As they walked, Jake thought about the challenges that still lay ahead. River wasn't fully healed, physically or emotionally. There were still scars beneath her fur, still a wariness in her eyes when strangers approached. But for the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to hope. Maybe they could all heal together. Maybe the broken pieces they had been living with for so long could finally begin to fit back together. As they reached the end of the road, Jake stopped and looked down at River. She sat at his feet, her eyes looking up at him with complete trust. "You're a good girl, River," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're part of the family now." River's tail wagged gently, and Jake reached down to scratch her behind the ears. For a brief moment, he felt at peace, as if all the pain, all the struggles, had been worth it. They had made it through the storm together. It was an early evening when the knock at the door came, the sound sharp and sudden, breaking the calm that had settled over the Bennett household in recent weeks. Jake was sitting on the couch, a cup of coffee in his hand, while Eli played quietly in the corner with River by his side. River had become more comfortable around the house, and she followed Eli everywhere, even sitting beside him as he worked on his homework. Jake wasn't expecting anyone. The town had settled into a quiet lull since the flood, and while the community had been supportive, offering help when they could, Jake had kept to himself mostly. He didn't need anyone coming around, didn't want to entertain any distractions. But the knock was insistent, sharp, almost demanding. Eli looked up from his work, his eyes wide. "Who is it, Dad?" Jake stood slowly, setting his coffee cup down. He shot Eli a quick glance before walking toward the door. The air around him felt suddenly tense, and the warmth of the house seemed to drain away. His hand hesitated on the doorknob for just a moment. Something in his gut told him that this wasn't going to be a normal visit. When he opened the door, he was met with a man he didn't recognize. He was tall, with a rough, unshaven face, and an air of aggression about him that was impossible to ignore. The man's clothes were worn like he hadn't bothered to change in days. His eyes were hard, filled with a mixture of irritation and something darker. "Is this where the German Shepherd's been taken?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff. Jake froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His first instinct was to slam the door shut, but he held his ground, forcing himself to remain calm. The man had no right to be here, no right to be asking about River. "I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, trying to sound as neutral as possible. The man's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. I know you've got her. She's mine." Jake's blood ran cold. There was something in the way the man said it, something that made Jake realize just how serious this situation was. He didn't know if the man had been looking for River all this time, or if he had just stumbled upon the house. But there was an edge to his tone that made Jake's heart race. "I'm sorry," Jake said again, trying to keep his voice steady, "but I don't think that's your dog. She's been through a lot, and she's with us now." The man's jaw clenched, and Jake could see his hands balling into fists. The tension in the air thickened, and Jake's instincts screamed at him to close the door. But before he could make a move, the man spoke again. "I know it's her," the man insisted, his voice rising in anger. "She's mine. I've been looking for her for months. She got away from me, and I want her back. You don't know what she's been through. I'm the one who's been taking care of her. She doesn't belong here." Jake's blood boiled. He didn't know who this man was, but it was clear from his words that he wasn't the kind of person who had cared for River. If anything, the man had been the source of her pain. Jake's protective instincts kicked in. River had come to them for safety, and he wasn't about to let someone like this take her away. "She stays with us," Jake said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "She's part of our family now. I'm not letting you take her." The man's expression twisted into something more menacing, and Jake could see the veins in his neck bulging as he stepped closer to the door. "You think you're better than me. You think you can just steal what's mine and get away with it. You have no idea what I've been through. She's mine, and I'm taking her." Before Jake could react, the man shoved forward, trying to force his way past him. But Jake stood firm, his hand slamming the door shut before the man could get inside. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, and Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced over at Eli, who was now standing behind him, eyes wide with fear. River, too, had heard the commotion. She was at Eli's side instantly, her body tense, her tail tucked between her legs. She sensed the danger in the air. "Dad, what's happening?" Eli asked, his voice trembling. Jake took a deep breath, his hand still shaking. He knew what he had to do next. The man might have left for now, but Jake knew he wouldn't give up that easily. He would be back, and the situation would only escalate. Jake's protective instincts flared. He wouldn't let anyone hurt River again. "We're going to be okay, Eli," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "But we need to be ready. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. We need to call the authorities." Eli looked down at River, his face full of concern. "What if he comes back, Dad? What if he tries to take her?" Jake crouched down beside his son, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll make sure he doesn't get the chance. We're going to protect her. We'll do what we have to do to keep her safe." River, sensing the tension, nuzzled Eli's leg, her body trembling slightly. Jake's heart ached at the sight of her fear. He could see how deeply the dog had been affected by her past, how much trust she had lost. But he also knew that this wasn't her life anymore. She had found a place where she could heal, a place where she could be loved and cared for, and he would be damned if anyone was going to take that away from her. "We'll get through this," Jake said, his voice steady as he met Eli's gaze. "We're a family, and families protect each other. As the evening wore on, Jake made the call to the authorities, explaining the situation as clearly as he could. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he wasn't going to let the man come back and disrupt their lives again. A river had already suffered too much. The next few days were filled with tension. The authorities had been notified, and Jake made sure to keep a close watch on the house. The man hadn't returned yet, but Jake could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. River, too, seemed on edge, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. She stuck close to Eli, rarely straying far from his side. And Jake, he was determined to protect them both, no matter what it took. The days following the confrontation at the door were filled with an uneasy quiet. River seemed to sense the change in the air. The calm, slow progress she had made since arriving at the Bennett house was suddenly clouded by a looming threat. Her behavior shifted slightly. She was more skittish, more alert, eyes constantly scanning the windows, ears pricked at every sound. Eli, too, noticed the change. He could see the anxiety in River's eyes, the way she would pull away from him when he tried to comfort her. Jake, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The man hadn't returned yet, but the memory of his menacing words and the anger in his voice haunted Jake's thoughts. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. His protective instincts were running high, and he found himself on edge more than he had ever been in his life. The man had threatened River, and Jake wasn't about to let anyone take her away from him. Not after all she had been through. Jake spent most of his time reinforcing the security around the house. He installed new locks, double-checked the windows, and made sure that all the doors were properly secured. He didn't want to risk leaving any opening for the man to slip through. As much as he hated to admit it, he knew the man would return. He was relentless, and Jake was certain that if he didn't act fast, River's safety would be at risk. Eli, too, had noticed the tension. He would glance nervously out the window whenever he heard a car pull into the driveway, and he had taken to sleeping on the couch with River by his side at night. Jake couldn't blame him. They both felt the same sense of unease, the same fear of what might happen next. One evening, after dinner, Jake took a moment to sit down with Eli in the living room. River lay beside them, her head resting on Eli's feet, her body still, but tense. Jake had been thinking a lot about the situation lately, weighing the options before him. He knew he needed to take action, but he wasn't sure what the best course of action was. Should he call the authorities again? Should he try to get a restraining order against the man? He didn't want to escalate things further, but at the same time, he couldn't afford to let River, or his family, be put in harm's way. Eli looked up at his father, his brow furrowed with worry. "Dad, what if he comes back? What if he tries to take River again?" Jake glanced down at River, who had lifted her head at the sound of Eli's voice. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment Jake saw something in them, a silent plea for reassurance. It was as if River, in her own way, was asking Jake to keep her safe, to protect her from the man who had hurt her in the past. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice low but firm. We'll do whatever it takes, Eli. I promise. No one is taking River from us. Not now. Not ever." Eli nodded slowly, but Jake could see the uncertainty in his son's eyes. "But what if he hurts you, Dad? What if he hurts us?" Eli's voice was barely a whisper, full of fear. Jake's heart clenched at the thought. He had tried to shield Eli from the harsh realities of life, to protect him from the things that scared him. But this was different. This wasn't just a storm they could ride out. This was real. And Jake knew that if the man returned, there would be no avoiding the confrontation. He had to be ready. "I'll protect you," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "I'll protect both of you, River, you, and me. We're a family now, and we look out for each other. No one gets to hurt us again." Eli didn't respond, but the small, shaky smile on his face was enough to reassure Jake. He knew that, deep down, Eli trusted him. And he trusted River, too. She had become part of their family in a way he never expected. She wasn't just a pet. She was a companion, a protector in her own right. And Eli had come to depend on her just as much as she depended on him. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Jake stayed up later than usual. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing with thoughts of the man and what he might do. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the occasional wind gust rattling the windows. River was lying at the foot of Eli's bed, her body still, but her eyes never fully closed. Jake had come to know this look from her, her alertness, her constant readiness to spring into action. It was the same look she had when they first found her, when she was so terrified and fragile. But now, there was something different about her. She was stronger. She was ready to protect them, just as they had protected her. Jake sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the phone in his hand. He knew he needed to make a decision, whether to call the authorities again or take matters into his own hands. But before he could make a choice, he heard it. A noise. A faint sound outside. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it was enough to make Jake freeze. He stood up quickly, heart pounding, and walked quietly to the window, peering through the blinds. At first he saw nothing, just the darkness of the night, the quiet stillness of the neighborhood. But then he saw it. A shadow moving at the edge of the yard. It was a figure, tall and unmistakable. The same man. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew the man had returned. This time, he would be caught off guard. River had been right all along. Danger was on the horizon. Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew what he had to do. The air was thick with anticipation. Jake's mind raced as he stared at the shadowy figure outside the window, his hand clenched around the phone. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could call the authorities, but would they get here in time? Or would he have to face this man himself? Protect River and Eli with his own two hands? There wasn't time to waste. The man had already crossed the threshold of their lives once. Jake knew he couldn't let it happen again. Not now. Eli had gone to bed hours earlier, the soft rhythm of his breathing coming from the room next door. But Jake knew his son was just as scared as he was. He could hear it in his voice, the uncertainty, the fear that he would lose River, lose the only family they had left. Jake couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Eli see him falter, couldn't let him feel the fear that gnawed at Jake's own insides. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. His mind screamed at him to wait, to make the smart call. He could call the police, explain the situation, but something inside him refused to wait. If the authorities weren't quick enough, if they didn't take the threat seriously enough, the man would come for River. And Jake couldn't let that happen. Not again. River, sensing the tension, padded quietly over to Jake. Her head low, her body trembling slightly as she sat at his feet, her eyes met his, full of silent trust, and for a moment Jake felt a rush of emotion, a fierce protectiveness for this dog who had been through more than anyone should endure, and yet still managed to offer a quiet strength to the family who had taken her in. Jake knelt down beside her, stroking her head gently. "You're not going anywhere," he whispered to her, the words more for his own reassurance than anything else. "We're going to make sure you're safe. I won't let him hurt you." River's tail flicked once in response, a faint wag of reassurance, but it didn't fully erase the fear in her eyes. Jake stood up and moved toward the door, his resolve hardening with every step. He had to act now. He wasn't going to wait for the police to figure out what needed to be done. This was his family, and he would protect them. But before Jake could reach the door, there was a loud knock, as sharp and insistent. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and he froze. The man was here, and he was knocking at the door. There was no time left to hesitate. Jake turned to look at Eli's bedroom door, his heart in his throat. He didn't want to put his son in danger, but he couldn't let Eli face this alone. He had to be strong for him. For both of them. Without saying a word, Jake moved to Eli's room, gently pushing open the door. Eli was sitting up in bed, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. River had followed Jake, her body tense, but she stayed close to Eli's side. "Dad," Eli whispered, his voice shaking. "What's going to happen?" Jake crouched down beside the bed, his voice soft but filled with determination. "It's going to be okay, Eli. But I need you to listen to me. If something happens, if he comes inside, we need to stick together, okay? We'll stay in here, we'll call for help, but we'll make sure we're safe." Eli nodded, his lip trembling. He was scared, and Jake knew it, but there was something in Eli's eyes now. Something that showed he trusted his father, trusted that Jake would do whatever it took to keep him safe. Jake reached out, ruffling Eli's hair, trying to offer the comfort he so desperately needed to hear. "We're a family, Eli," Jake said quietly. "We protect each other, no matter what." Eli's small, trembling hands reached out to grab Jake's, a silent promise that they would face this together. "I'm not scared," Eli whispered, though his voice cracked with emotion. "I'm not scared as long as you're here." Jake squeezed his son's hand, a knot forming in his throat. He wished he could promise that nothing bad would happen, that everything would turn out fine, but he knew the truth was far more uncertain. The man outside was dangerous, and Jake had no idea what lengths he might go to in order to take River. But he couldn't let that fear cripple him. Not now. Not when they were so close to finding a sense of peace. He stood up, and River immediately moved to stand at his side. She looked up at him, as if asking for the same thing Eli had. Reassurance. Jake gently patted her head, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "Stay close, girl. Stay close." The knock at the door came again, louder this time, and Jake knew it was time. He made his way to the front door, River following close behind. He hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath, before he opened the door. Just a crack. The man was standing there, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, a look of determination on his face. "I told you," the man said, his voice rough and impatient. "I want the dog, now." Jake's heart raced, but he kept his voice calm, his posture firm. "You're not taking her," he said. "But she's not yours anymore. She's part of our family, and she's staying here." The man's eyes flickered with anger, and for a moment Jake thought he might charge into the house. But then the man's gaze shifted to River, who was standing just behind Jake, her ears back and her tail tucked between her legs. "You don't know what she's been through," the man spat, his voice venomous. "She owes me. She's mine." Jake stood his ground, unwavering. "She owes you nothing. She's been through enough." There was a long, tense silence as the two men stared at each other, the air thick with hostility. Jake's mind raced, but he kept his focus on the man in front of him, refusing to show any weakness. And then, just as Jake thought the situation might escalate, the sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance. The sound of sirens. The man's face twisted in frustration, his eyes darting toward the road. He knew the authorities were on their way. With a final venomous glare, he turned and stalked off toward his car, his figure disappearing into the night. Jake watched him go, his chest tight with adrenaline. He had won this round, but he knew the man wouldn't give up so easily. This wasn't over. But for now, River and Eli were safe. Jake closed the door, his body finally relaxing. He turned back to Eli and River, his heart swelling with relief. They had made it through. For now, they were safe. The man didn't return the next night, or the next. Days turned into weeks, and the fear that had gripped the Bennett family slowly began to ebb. The calm that settled back into their lives felt like a fragile thing, but for the first time in a long while, it was theirs to keep. River, who had once been a silent, fearful presence, was now an active, vibrant part of their world. She had become Eli's shadow, following him everywhere he went, her tail wagging eagerly whenever he returned home from school, as if she were his personal guardian. Jake had come to see how much River's presence had changed his son. Eli, who had been so withdrawn after his mother's death, now smiled more often. He laughed in the evenings when River clumsily tried to chase after a ball, her long legs awkward as she tumbled over herself. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of silence, still reminders of the grief they carried. But River had brought something new into their lives: joy. The mornings were no longer marked by the weight of sadness, but by the soft sounds of River's paws on the wooden floor as she padded into the kitchen, sitting patiently by Eli's feet as he ate his breakfast. Her once matted coat had begun to shine, her ribs less visible, her steps lighter. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving, learning to trust again. And so was Eli. One Saturday afternoon, Jake took Eli and River out to the park. It was the first time in a long while that they had ventured far from the house. Eli had insisted they bring River along, and Jake, after a moment's hesitation, agreed. He knew that they needed to get out, to break the routine of their quiet home life and face the world again. They had all been through so much, but maybe, just maybe, this was a step toward rebuilding. As they arrived at the park, Eli wasted no time letting River off her leash. She bounded forward, her energy infectious, and Eli laughed, his joy echoing through the air. River, no longer the hesitant dog she had been when I first brought her home, ran freely across the grass, her tail held high, her body strong and confident. "Look at her go!" Eli exclaimed, his face lit up with pride. Jake watched them from the bench, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. For the first time, he realized that the life they had created, with all its imperfections, was enough. It was everything they needed. They had a home again, a place where they could heal, where they could feel safe. Jake leaned back on the bench, his eyes drifting toward the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light across the park. He felt something shift inside of him, something deep and peaceful. The shadows that had loomed over their lives for so long were beginning to recede. Eli returned to him a few minutes later, River by his side, both of them out of breath, but smiling. "You were right, Dad," Eli said, sitting down beside him, his face flushed with excitement. "This was a good idea. I think she's happy here, don't you?" Jake nodded, his hand resting on Eli's shoulder. "I think she's found her place," he said softly, his eyes meeting Eli's. "And so have we." River sat down beside them, her tongue lolling out of her mouth, her eyes shining with contentment. For a moment, everything felt right. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. Together. The next few weeks passed in much the same way. River's transformation from a broken, fearful animal into a confident and joyful companion continued. She began to play with Eli more, chasing balls, running through the yard, and even learning tricks. She wasn't perfect. Sometimes she would freeze at sudden noises or flinch when a car passed by. But each day was a little better than the last. And each day, Jake saw the dog's strength grow, just as his own strength was growing. Jake had always prided himself on being a protector, a provider, but it wasn't just River who needed protection now. It was Eli, too. Eli needed him, just as River did. And Jake realized that protecting them didn't just mean keeping them safe from outside threats. It meant being there for them emotionally when the darkness of the past threatened to resurface. One night, as they sat together on the couch, watching a movie, Eli suddenly spoke, his voice unusually serious for a 10-year-old. "Dad, do you think Mom would have liked River?" Jake glanced at his son, seeing the quiet longing in his eyes. It was the first time Eli had mentioned his mother in weeks. He wasn't sure how to answer, but he knew this was a moment of connection, a moment where the walls that Eli had built around himself were beginning to come down. "I think she would have loved her," Jake said quietly, his hand resting on Eli's head. "She loved animals, remember? She would have been happy knowing that River's here with us." Eli nodded, a small smile appearing on his face as he leaned against his father. For a long while, They sat in comfortable silence, River curled up at their feet. The light from the TV flickered across the room, casting gentle shadows on the walls. In that moment, it didn't matter that they had lost so much. What mattered was what they had now. They had each other. They had River, and together they would rebuild the pieces of their lives. The seasons began to shift in Millwood, as they always did. The air grew crisp with the arrival of fall, the trees lining the streets changing colors, and the smell of wood smoke mingling with the scent of earth. It was a time of transformation, and it seemed fitting. The Bennett family had weathered their own storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to move forward, healed in ways they hadn't expected. Jake had always believed that time healed all wounds, but he'd come to realize that it wasn't time alone that healed him. Eli and River, it was love. It was the quiet, steady moments shared with those who mattered most. It was the unspoken connection between a boy and his dog, a man and his son. All of them bound together by something more than just shared space. It was the healing power of second chances. It was early morning when Jake and Eli stood together at the bus stop, River sitting calmly beside them, her fur shining in the cool light of dawn. Eli was already in his school uniform, a backpack slung over his shoulders. He looked different now, more confident, more at ease in his own skin. The sadness that had hung over him for so long had begun to lift, and though he still carried the memory of his mother, it wasn't as heavy as it had been before. His smile was brighter, his laughter more frequent, and Jake saw how much his son had grown, not just physically, but emotionally. "Be good today, kiddo," Jake said, his voice warm but tinged with the bittersweet feeling that always came when he realized how much time had passed. It felt like only yesterday that Eli had been so small, so lost in his grief, and now here he was, standing tall, ready to face the world. Eli smiled up at him, a soft, knowing smile. "I will, Dad. And River will keep you company, right?" he added, bending down to pat the dog's head. River's tail thumped against the ground in response, her eyes following Eli as if she understood every word. Jake crouched down to Eli's level, a proud glint in his eyes. "She'll keep me company. She always does." He ruffled his son's hair before standing up and watching him walk toward the bus that had just pulled up. Eli turned back for a moment, flashing Jake one last grin before he climbed aboard. Jake stood there, the cool morning air brushing against his face, and he felt a quiet peace settle within him. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever would be. But it was enough. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he could breathe without the weight of grief pressing down on him, without the fear of what might happen next. The uncertainty that had once consumed him had been replaced by a new certainty, that they had each other. And that was all they really needed. As the bus drove away, Jake turned back toward the house, his hand instinctively reaching out for River, who was still sitting beside him, her eyes calm and watchful. She had come so far from the broken dog they had first found in the floodwaters. She had healed, and in the process, she had helped him and Eli heal too. The house was quiet when Jake entered, the warmth of the morning sunlight spilling through the windows. It wasn't just the house that had changed. It was everything. It was the way they moved through the world now, with a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. They had faced the storm together, and together they had rebuilt. River padded quietly behind Jake as he moved through the house, heading toward the kitchen. Her steps were steady now, her tail held high, her body no longer tense and afraid. She had found her place, just as they had found theirs. Jake sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts quiet for the first time in what felt like forever. He looked over at River, who was now lying at his feet, her head resting on her paws. She looked content, at peace, something that had once seemed impossible for her. "You did it," Jake said softly, his voice full of pride. "You made it." River lifted her head, meeting his gaze, her eyes calm and trusting. It was the same look she had given him when they first found her, that silent plea for help, for safety. And now, it was the look of a dog who had found a home, a family, and a place where she could finally feel free. Jake leaned down, gently scratching behind her ears. River's tail thumped lightly against the floor in response, the sound so full of contentment it made Jake smile. In that moment, Jake realized something important. Sometimes the broken find each other. Sometimes the pieces that seem irreparably damaged fit together in a way that makes sense. He had found his way back from the darkness, just as River had. They had been two lost souls, struggling to survive. But now they had found each other. They had found the love, the connection, the safety they both needed to rebuild. The door opened, and Eli came back inside, his face flushed from the cold air. River jumped up from her spot, her tail wagging, and Eli grinned as she bounded toward him. "I'm back, River," Eli exclaimed, kneeling down to give the dog a hug. She licked his face, her joy evident, and Eli laughed, the sound clear and full of life. Jake watched them, his heart swelling with gratitude. They had come so far. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, and they were stronger than ever before. As Eli stood up and walked into the living room, Jake turned to River, his voice quiet but filled with warmth. "We're family, girl," he said, his hand resting gently on her head. "And we're going to be okay." River wagged her tail in response, her eyes soft, her body relaxed. The past might never completely fade, but in that moment, Jake knew that together they could face anything. The broken could rebuild. And sometimes that was enough.